Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I am the co-director of the Center on the Future of War, which is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. And we explore different aspects of conflict through educational programming, through research initiatives, and also through public outreach, such as tonight's event. This is the last event of the Fall Speaker Series, and we're really honored to have with us today Robert Schmidle, who many of you know. He's a faculty member here at the center and at ASU, as well as Rob Joyce, who's director of NSA's Cybersecurity Directorate, which is charged with preventing and eradicating threats to U.S. security systems and critical infrastructure. Previously, he was the Special U.S. Liaison Officer in London, which is the NSA's top cryptological representative in the United Kingdom. He's also held positions in the National Security Council, serving as Cybersecurity Coordinator and Special Assistant to the President, including time as acting Deputy Homeland Security Advisor and acting Homeland Security Advisor. At the NSA, Joyce has also been the Deputy Director to the former Information Assurance Directorate, as well as Director of Tailored Access Operations. And with us, as mentioned, is retired Lieutenant General Robert Schmidle of the Marine Corps. He's currently University Advisor on Cyber Capabilities and Conflict Studies at Arizona State University. Also a professor of practice with us here at the Center on the Future of War and the School of Politics and Global Studies. While on active duty, he served as the first Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command, as well as Head of Marine Aviation and Principal Deputy Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He has nearly 4,700 hours in tactical fighters participating in combat operations in Iraq and Bosnia. He also has a Ph.D. from Georgetown University and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Security Agency Advisory Board, the Defense Science Board, and the British Wittgenstein Society. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you so much to General Schmidle, Mr. Joyce. A little bit of housekeeping. We will have the presentation for 35 minutes or so, and then we'll go to questions and answers from those of you out there in the audience. The way to enter those questions is in the question box in Zoom, and I'll play the role of moderating that. So if you think of questions during the presentation, that would be great. And again, thank you, everybody, and we look forward to the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. So as Daniel said, my name is Bob Schmidle, and what we're going to do here for the next little bit here is have a discussion with Rob about what he's doing now and what he's going to be doing in the future and how he sees the future of the threat environment and NSA's role going forward. And so the first question that I wanted to address with Rob is, he's the second director of the Cybersecurity Directorate. And I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of background on why the directorate was stood up and what your focus on has been on, and what do you see in the future for the Cybersecurity Directorate?
Sure. So first, thanks for letting me come tonight and talk. I think it's always exciting to get to speak to students and folks who are trying to broaden their horizons. So really appreciate that. The NSA's Cybersecurity Directorate has a major responsibility to protect national security systems. So that's anything that carries classified information, does warfighting networking, or is part of intelligence activities. So we're responsible for the keys, codes, and cryptography to protect any information kind of in that domain. And as you think about what computers have evolved to these days, they've gotten so much more entwined in everything we do, whether it's the information on our computer desktop, but all the way out to the military's weapons, which are now computers that fly and float and explode and swim under the water. So we haven't historically thought about how we protect those things to the level the adversaries are exploiting today. So the Cybersecurity Directorate was stood up to continue the NSA historical work doing the keys, codes, and crypto, but also bring in the idea that we have a superpower here at NSA. We have foreign intelligence. So we're merging threat intelligence into everything we do now. So we would now look at what do adversaries know or intend to do against those military communication systems? What are the adversaries doing to get at our classified communications across the U.S. government or the ones we have with allies? And that gives you a whole different mindset if you start out with a threat and then try to use that to drive your actions. So it's changed the way that we approach the defense, and we use the reach into foreign networks to understand that threat. And then we combine that with the knowledge we have here of exploiting other people's networks. The same way I'm trying to keep them out of ours, we go out into adversaries' networks to frankly steal their secrets. And so that gives us a practical understanding of, kind of it takes a thief to catch a thief. And so when you work on both sides of this, and my career has gone back and forth between SIGINT and cybersecurity, you get a better appreciation for the practical things an adversary will do to win. And that's really what it's all about, is how do you break that cycle of letting them get to success?
So is your background, because your background was on the defensive side and also potentially on the offensive side with regard to the adversary, is that kind of a balance what you think makes this directorate so effective, or is making it effective? And can you give me an example of some of the things you're doing today that you think are being most effective against the adversary?
Yeah, so absolutely, that blending of offense and defense gives us a unique understanding. So some things we're doing differently. We stood up an organization, the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, to bring industry together with our SIGINT knowledge and our cybersecurity expertise. Why is that different? The government's always said, hey, can you give me information about what you know? But we at NSA actually didn't have the authority to then tell our SIGINT to the companies to let them act on it or build additional information. And we've gotten new authorities in the last few years so that now we can do that bidirectional exchange. And what we found is, we can see what the adversary's plans, intentions, their infrastructure, maybe even steal their tools to do this defense. And then we talk to the people who run these networks globally, who have the endpoint information, and even do things domestically where you would never want or need the NSA to have visibility. So the company can hunt for the things we know the adversaries are using based on the SIGINT, and then they can hunt inside their corporate network and only bring out the malicious activity. And then we pair that with the things we see in foreign space. And it's a pretty beautiful cycle about what we can understand and then disrupt.
So could you give us talk a little bit more about SIGINT, signals intelligence? I just want to make sure we baseline the audience so that they understand exactly what it is. Can you give us an example of that and kind of explain a little bit about that? It's one of the foundational roles of NSA.
Yeah. So signals intelligence is the collection of transmissions or emanations or information as it transits the global networks. And our remit is foreign intelligence, so we can only operate, on signals that are outside and contain foreign intelligence. We also use what you consider hacking. So you move through the networks to get to the point where you can exploit a machine to bring back that data. And it gives you insights. So, in essence, one of the functions we perform is we try to hack the hackers. We go after their tools, their capability, their plans and intentions. And if you can get upstream in that ecosystem and see from their operational vantage point all the different companies that they've infected, then you can, from that one point, do many, many remediations.
Can we talk a little more about the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center? I know that the director of NSA, General Lacasoni, is very proud of that, and as are you, and you are the lead in getting this thing moving and going forward. Can you talk a little bit about what you do in there, what it is, and why we needed to have that? What kind of caused NSA to feel the need for that kind of a collaboration center?
Yeah, so we saw an enormous amount of information being stolen from the defense industrial base, the companies that make our military capabilities. So they're all the big defense contractors you'd think of. But in reality, there's maybe 18 or 20 of those big, massive defense contractors. but the ecosystem is 30,000 cleared companies that work for them in some form or fashion as subcontractors, and 300,000 companies that in some shape feed into the Defense Department. So that's an enormous amount of attack surface that our adversaries can go to try to get advantage, steal our information, manipulate our data. And so we were frankly seeing a lot of stuff lost in that ecosystem. So we got these new authorities. We started taking the SIGINT insights of what the threat and operations were and talking to those companies. But when you think about it, the Defense Department inside that ecosystem, we rely on computer manufacturers and cloud computing companies and antivirus vendors. So they are all part of that defense ecosystem. So we work with them to try to help protect those companies. And by doing that, yes, we protect those big companies that you would think of as defense contractors, but it also goes into the critical infrastructure sectors. It goes into our partners and allies networks. It goes into your home network and ours. If we can teach a major cloud vendor about what the Russians' latest techniques and capabilities are, it doesn't just protect the Defense Department. It actually goes to all of the customers in that cloud.
The threat is the threat that you talked about, the people that are siphoning intellectual property and data off of the defense industrial base grid, off of their networks. Are we talking about big countries like China and Russia and Iran? Are we talking about other non-state kind of actors? Can you give us a feel for what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, well, the big four we worry about are no surprise: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. In that space, they're the most prolific actors. There are others you've got to worry about, the whole ecosystem. But cyber criminals are also a growing concern. So if you came here 3 years ago, I wouldn't have said that we were putting a lot of resources into the cyber criminal ecosystem, but that's changed. What we're seeing is, cybersecurity writ large is national security. And we saw things like Colonial Pipeline show that we are vulnerable in ways we really didn't understand to people who may not intend to have a national security implication, but actually are. So, the criminals that went after Colonial Pipeline didn't intend to shut down gasoline distribution across the East Coast, but they did.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge issue. And so now we're using SIGINT and our capabilities to understand that threat. And by working with them and then the commercial companies that are, the fabric and foundation of the ecosystem, we help protect in that space as well.
There's been a lot in the press recently about anything from civic governments to companies that have been assaulted by or infected by ransomware. Is that a national security issue for us as well, or is it more of a criminal? How do you all see that?
Yeah, it is a national security issue, because when you have the fabric of society held at risk, and what we see are hospitals, schools, manufacturing plants, all of this ecosystem is now driven and dependent on computers. And criminals understand that if you have something that people depend on, and they can exploit it and hold it at risk, at that point they can monetize it, right? So they're just out to make money.
Yeah.
But in the end, the implications of the actions they take cause impact to the nation.
Is there any advice you could give to the folks that are listening tonight about how to protect themselves from ransomware, or is this such a technical? Do I need to be a computer scientist to figure that out? Or
there's a bunch of basics they should be doing. Right? The number one thing is keep your devices updated. Right. So whether you're on Windows or Apple Macintosh, whether you have an iPhone or a Google Android phone, the companies issue security updates regularly, and you need to install those as soon as they come out. The companies don't do that because they like to add things. Most of the time, they're issuing those updates for security reasons. So it's very important to take those updates and install them. Why? Because the criminals are going around and they're rattling the doorknobs. It's the equivalent of of finding the car that's unlocked in the neighborhood and just taking whatever you find inside it. If you lock your car, you're safe. If your neighbor doesn't, they're going to get robbed. And so that's the number one thing. The number two thing is password management. You should not be using the same password at multiple sites. It turns out that if one site with poor security gets breached, there's ways for hackers to steal your password at that site. And if you're using the same email and the same password at another, maybe your email site, you're in really, really bad trouble, because now they can just log in as you with that password at a site you didn't care much about. So you can either, there's a lot of ways to do it. A little black book and write your passwords down, a new one for each site, or get an electronic password manager that generates them and takes care of them for you. But those are the two top things: is update when you have updates and figure out a good password management system.
Well, thanks for that. That's and it sounds like just basic sort of blocking and tackling skills associated. So let's go from the tactical now up to the strategic. The war in Ukraine has been ongoing for almost a year now. The kinetic side of it, at least. From what you see here, is there anything you can share with us about what you have learned? More specifically, is there anything that surprised you about what the Russians did, the effectiveness of some of the cyber tactics, or surprised you about the defense, about the Ukraine? Can you give us some insight? I know that this is something that comes up in the course I teach all the time. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not this cyber war thing is what we think it is.
Yeah. So there was a lot of cyber activity around Ukraine. A lot of people expected cyber Armageddon here in the U.S. and were frankly almost disappointed that they didn't see it. But what we really did see was tremendous cyber attacks on Ukraine itself and the near abroad. So we saw more than 10 different families of wiper virus deployed against Ukrainian government.
Wiper virus is again?
So sure, it's a piece of malware, malicious software that tries to erase everything on your machine. So think about your home computer. If it gets hit, all of your photos, your past emails, all of the files you've accumulated, your old taxes would be gone. If it hits a business, their customer lists, their inventories, their accounting software, all of that. So it was aimed at banks, government. It was aimed at individuals. So 10 different families of viruses, new, uniquely created just for this fight. So a lot of different resources went into that. There was an attack on satellite services that provided communication support, and that was on the eve of the invasion. It was the Russians trying to take down the Ukrainians' ability to communicate militarily. They went beyond, though, just the Ukrainian footprint. They wound up hitting a large number of the connected users to that satellite service throughout Europe. They took down communications to wind farms in Germany. They took down some emergency communications in France, and then they took off a lot of business users. So that was a pretty large splatter, even beyond the battlefield. Why did it seem like it wasn't as big an event? Because the Ukrainians are pretty good. They've gotten very practiced at being resilient. So the Ukrainian system administrators have been under attack from Russia for years. The war in Crimea and others. If you remember the big ransomware, malware events of NotPetya and WannaCry that hit the globe, the NotPetya attack actually was a Russian attack on Ukraine that then spilled out into the whole global internet. So these things have been ongoing for years, and the Ukrainians have gotten good at backups and restoration and cybersecurity. So first, They do good things to keep the Russians out. Secondly, they've gotten pretty good at containing them. So when they get to one spot, they can't get to many machines. And then third, when they do have something destructive happen, they've gotten good at just kind of shrugging and getting out the backup and loading it back up and restoring it so they're not down very long. So that's one of my big lessons learned is you practice resilience and you can get fairly immune to some of the attacks that are coming. But I think the other was there was really, no kidding, a cyber war going on in and around Ukraine.
So the reason that the Russian cyber attacks did not have any long-term effectiveness was due to the procedures and the response that the Ukrainians had to that attack. So can we take from that a little bit of a positive spin on the way that we should be thinking about cyber attacks in the future? That if we are resilient, if we have procedures in place, and we kind of know how to work through these things, that we can mitigate a lot of so is that kind of what the good news story that we take out of that?
Yeah, I think it is. If you read the latest National Defense Strategy, there's a lot of discussion in there where we would line up under deterrence by denial, right? There's deterrence language inside that strategy. And so if the enemy doesn't think they can be successful or they have questions about whether they'll be successful, you get an element of deterrence in there.
Do you think that the reason that the Russians have taken to conducting massive kinetic attacks against the electrical infrastructure is because their cyber attacks didn't have the effectiveness they wanted to? Or
I think the Ukrainians have improved their resiliency over time, right? So that's one aspect of it. Their electric grid was subject to Russian attack over multiple years. They have gotten better. They took actions to even disconnect from portions of the grid and reconnect into the European side. But the other thing is, you can be assured of a kinetic attack, right? Again, that deterrence by denial. If you have some question as to whether you'll be successful in the cyber arena and you've got something that can leave a smoking crater where the transformer was, often the military will go for the smoking crater option.
Yeah, for sure. What do we know, or what can you give us any insight into the Russian disinformation campaigns, the social media, it almost smacks of what the Chinese are referring to recently as cognitive warfare, trying to change the perceptions that people have about what's actually happening out there. Can you get some insight, or can you talk a little bit about what we've seen the Russians do and or the Ukrainians? I mean, it appears that the Ukrainians have been relatively successful in that, kind of getting inside of some of the decision cycles. So that's just from the outside looking in. Could you have any other insight?
Yeah, I think excuse me, the Russians have a long history of weaponizing information and spinning the truth to their advantage. And it was clear before, during, and after the invasion that apparatus was in full effect. I think from our point of view, the idea that we can use the intelligence to understand and unmask the misperceptions or the misinformation, that's a powerful tool. The strong light of truth is often some of the best cleansing activity you can do against the malign influence and misinformation. So we just came through an election here in the U.S., right? We had the midterm elections. One of the things we were very much on guard for was misinformation, disinformation. In terms of the recent election, I think that's a very good news story with what DHS and FBI as the nation's leads for protecting the elections and working against disinformation. I think that was a pretty powerful success. Now, what we're seeing most is adversaries not manufacturing lines of disinformation against the U.S., but just amplifying divisive messages, right? Trying to to pull us apart. And their belief is if they can make democracy less healthy, then it strengthens their position.
It would seem that that problem would not necessarily beget a simple technical solution either. So that's a,
It's not straight cybersecurity.
Yeah.
So not as much money.
yeah, exactly. So talking about resiliency, I know that one of the other missions that the Directorate was focused on when it stood up was to look at the vulnerabilities in weapon systems and resiliency in weapon systems. And I guess we could call a weapon system anything from a platform, from an airplane to a command and control network. Could you give us some insight into where we are, where we as a Department of Defense are now with that, and what kind of success and how, and what kinds of things make it difficult for us to increase the levels of cybersecurity resiliency?
Yeah. So it is a major effort for us. It's known as the Strategic Cybersecurity Program. So we're looking at some of the most important weapons platforms in the U.S. inventory and trying to understand how are they vulnerable and what can we do to mitigate the vulnerabilities that are probably the most heinous, the ones, frankly, NSA would go after if we were trying to exploit a foreign weapon system. So using that understanding and that framing, we're trying to, in essence, harden them and make them defensible. So the first step is you have to acknowledge that these are computer systems, right? I mentioned that, the amount of computers on a modern weapons platform is astronomical, and there's even small networks on the platform themselves. And so you've got to be able to instrument them and see attacks on them. You've got to be able to defend them with the principles of modern defensive networks. And just like I suggested, people have to patch their home computers and their home phones. We've got to keep them updated because the technology in them is often years and years old, and the state of the art of exploitation has advanced since that weapon was first designed. And so we've got to continue upgrading the technology to account for cybersecurity and not just the functionality.
Well, that's very, very well stated. When in another life, when I was responsible for fielding the F-35, one of the ways we would describe that airplane to people that were not intimate with the systems is it literally, think of it as a computer with wings. That's what it does. And the folks that are flying it these days are much more involved in the system than in the computerized systems in the airplane than previous generations of pilots were. If I could just spin off of one other thing you mentioned before about deterrence. You talked about deterrence, and we talked about the ability to potentially deter in cyberspace. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to how you all are interpreting the department's integrated deterrence posture and how that plays into what you do here in the Cybersecurity Directorate?
Yeah. So I mentioned, one of our key roles is fundamentally deterrence by denial, right? We have to make sure that if somebody has the intent to do something malicious to our networks, our infrastructure, our information, that they can't count on being successful. And so that means we have to mount the defenses that are going to protect those systems and that information. Additionally, there's an amount of deterrence that we foster by making sure the weapons platforms and the things all the way up to and including the nuclear triad are both secure and will operate when needed. Right. And so we want to make sure that there's no doubt in our military or national command structure that they can order the use and appropriately deploy those measures when called for.
So the thought would be that if I'm an adversary, that what deters me from spending a lot of my time and energy trying to attack a particular network is the knowledge that that network is resilient enough and that it is defensible enough that I am probably not going to be successful. In other words, it's deterring me not because I'm afraid something's going to happen to me, but because my chances of success are so low. Is that kind of an accurate assessment?
That's accurate.
You know, the other thing that's been in the news recently is the cryptocurrency flail, as it were. And people, I know that a lot of people that I know are having a great deal of difficulty generating a lot of sympathy for these people that have lost billions in cryptocurrency. But do you see that the cryptocurrency, the criminal networks around that, how do you see that affecting our national? Does it or doesn't it, or is it sort of a nebulous thing on the side?
Well, we talked earlier about the scourge of ransomware.
Yeah.
Ransomware is all about monetizing the ability to exploit a network. And one of the ways they monetize is they ask for payments in cryptocurrency. Okay. There are some of the cryptocurrencies which are, designed to obfuscate the transactions and the identity of the parties involved, right? And so that's tailor-made for criminal use. Is the ability to receive a ransom and then profit from that ransom. So yes, cryptocurrency has a role in this ecosystem and trying to disrupt the financial transactions and the ability to pull the money out after you've done a criminal act. That's something very important too.
Are there vulnerabilities in that system that could potentially be exploited, or is the kind of the sort of blockchain technology, does that bring a certain amount of security to the criminals in the way that they exchange crypto?
Yeah. So it certainly gives them some amount of security, but I think if you just study the FBI indictments and some of the arrests and the activities of cryptocurrency seizures and other things, there are vulnerabilities, right? So it's not always perfect. A lot of times it's good enough, and so that's the tension.
Rob, this has been an awesome conversation, and I greatly appreciate you spending time with us. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to Daniel. And Daniel, if you got some questions from the audience there that we can address to Rob.
Sure. And just a quick note to everybody out there in the audience, please drop your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. You mentioned deterrence by denial as a sort of standard mode of providing protection to cyber systems. But I'm wondering, we don't hear that much about offensive cyber capabilities on the part of the United States, whereas we hear an enormous amount about offensive capabilities of more, typical kinetic weapons. You can go to shows and you can read, quite detailed reviews of some aspects of what they're able to do. So, without revealing anything, what is it that the public should know about the U.S.'s offensive cyber capabilities and their role in cybersecurity for the nation?
Yeah, so I'll start this, and then you might want to talk to General Schmidle, who was the Deputy Commander for the U.S.'s offensive cyber capability, right? So NSA has tremendous technical expertise, and we do things, to exploit computer systems, but it is for that purpose of pulling out intelligence. It's not an offensive weapon in that sense, but why do you read about the specifications of a bomb, but you don't read about the U.S.'s implant that could deliver offensive cyber operations? Because those that type of information, one would let you detect it and find it, and again prevent it. Or it may allow you to attribute it if there was a desire to do an effect that was intended to be non-attributable. So there's a host of reasons that, if you're revealing too much about the capabilities you have, how they function, and what's the envelope you can expect to use them in, you're giving the adversary a lot of chances both to detect and then, more importantly, defend or defeat it. Sir?
So Daniel, I think the best answer that I could give you is that the things that we are capable of doing would make you proud to be an American. And I think that's probably a good way to just think about this. what Rob said, though, is absolutely on target. As opposed to rolling out a new airplane, like even like an F-35, I mean, we don't publicly talk about all of the capabilities that that airplane has, right? For obvious reasons. The airplane itself could potentially be seen as a deterrent of some sort. Again, you know, the issue with deterrence, as you're well aware, is really in the eyes of the person you're trying to deter, not necessarily what we think the deterrent is, but who those other folks are. But I think that it is an area of capabilities that changes quite frequently. And there's also, for all the lawyers in the audience and all the policy wonks, there's some significant differences between the authorities that organizations have to do certain things. And those authorities are set down to try to delineate between, for instance, intelligence collection and offensive operations, so that the two of them remain in a separate area. So I think that there's not much more that I can add to what Rob said, except that, and chances are you probably are not even aware, and that would be one of the strengths of some of those capabilities, that they're even being employed. But
Well, thanks so much. And so I guess one takeaway from that is that there's some deterrence component of offensive capabilities, which might be significant, just as to file away as a thought, right?
It depends. I mean, you'd have to really climb into the head of the adversary to understand whether or not they believe that to be a deterrent against them doing something else. And it may not be a direct linear relationship. It may be that things don't go the way they expect them to go in a certain area, and they're never quite sure why, but they just don't ever get there. So, you know, it's kind of an obtuse answer is the best I could tell you.
Sure. A question here from John Peterson. I'm sorry. Is there more to the response? Okay. Question from John Peterson. Is the NSA required to disclose zero-day vulnerabilities to US-based manufacturers?
So we have a national policy that governs not only NSA, but the whole of the government. So, you know, that includes the Defense Department, the intel community, the law enforcement community. It's called the Vulnerabilities Equities Process, and it's managed by the White House. So the requirement is when we find a vulnerability in a software or a computer device, we would take it to the Vulnerability Equities process, which is an interagency process that includes both intel, law enforcement, as well as economic entities and cybersecurity entities. So CIS is at the table. DHS is at the table in the larger role. Treasury and Commerce are there, as is FBI, Cybercom, NSA, and others. And so there's a series of criteria, and there's some White House publications on this of, you know, how do we make a decision to release or retain a vulnerability? And, you know, the bias is toward release, and you will see things like NSA divulging a lot of 0 days this year in products like Microsoft Windows and routers and other things, to include a pretty significant 0 day that we told Microsoft about this year, where you could go in and pretend and sign a piece of software as Microsoft and get it accepted by your home machine, which would really be a devastating attack, right? So that kind of capability was all brought and released. So there's a process that oversees it. You know, folks like Cyber Command, who will need capabilities and 0 days, you know, will at times have to present a case for a retention of a vulnerability. But by and large, you know, the release process is the bias.
A question here from Vic Einfeld. What are your thoughts on the Australians signaling of becoming more proactive in their disruptive cyber capabilities?
I think that's that's an important effort where they've taken both the law enforcement entities and the cybersecurity entities, as well as the offensive cyber entities, and put them together. Why is it important? Well, ransomware is criminal. The idea that that you will arrest everybody who is involved in ransomware is just not reality, right? We're not going to arrest our way out of this, especially because there's large groups of cyber criminals in safe havens like Russia. You've got nation states like North Korea who actively who actively use criminal ransomware and cybersecurity thefts to generate hard currency to avoid sanctions in their regime. So beyond the legal tools, what other tools do you have? Well, you have some of the things like ASD going after the tools and the infrastructure and the capability. You have the ability to use the intelligence capability to understand who's involved, and maybe then create opportunities for arrests or extraditions. So I think it's a pretty interesting experiment. As many of you may understand, we have a really tight relationship across what we call the Five Eyes. So Australia, Canada, U.S., New Zealand, and the UK, where we share signals intelligence very robustly. And we're all working together on the ransomware issue today.
A question, to what degree does the NSA and other government entities that need to recruit individuals with incredibly advanced skills, to what degree, like, how do you bring those folks in when they can probably relatively easily turn to employers in Silicon Valley or elsewhere and earn salaries significantly higher with a variety of other kinds of benefits? What's the key to pulling those folks in, which I'm sure you must deal with all the time?
So the key is easy. We have really awesome, cool work, right? So, when I led the organization that was responsible to do the hacking for NSA, right? You can't legally do that anywhere else, right? So where are you going to go? You're going to be constantly looking over your shoulder for the FBI, or you're going to come to NSA and join that elite team. So that's the why. I joined NSA about 33 years ago. Haven't looked back. I've had amazing opportunities, just to be part of things that are, constantly in the news. You read it about it above the fold in the newspaper, and somebody here at NSA is working on it. At the same time, the most important successes, the things I'm probably most proud of, are things that never made it into the newspaper because of the things we did, right? So that's just really, really cool. It's an awesome opportunity. I've also had the chances to punch out of government over the years to unbelievably large salary offers, and that's not how I'm wired. I've got an awesome, great life. I don't need that. There is a delta between what I could make on the outside and what I could make here. But I could never do in industry the things I do here. I could never be involved in those same things. So it really is, it's an awesome lifestyle choice.
Interesting. To get to, the world is relatively familiar with the kind of looming dangers of cybersecurity. We think, we're connected all day long. We have these devices. I think for most of us, I think we've been fortunate enough to not experience the potential devastation, right? But what is it that is the most surprising, or what is it that we should know that we don't know about this odd life we live, of a type of vulnerability that we both feel and don't feel as part of our ordinary lives? For those of us who are not technologically in the know, we really can't assess this level of risk, even though we're sort of mildly aware. And then we periodically consume, movies and the like that show, apocalyptic visions of what would happen in a major cyber attack.
Yeah, I don't have a good pithy answer for that, but I think the thing I would I would think about is just how much of your life is online, and my cell phone knows an amazing amount of information about me, right? Google is much more aware of the information I touch every day, the places I'm at, the things I do, the people I interact with, than almost anybody, right? And I think that's a powerful thing when the advertisers and the companies have that incredible scope of insight and understanding. So what am I looking out at the horizon line at? And I think it's the machine learning models that are arriving fast, right? If anybody plays with some of the content generation, whether it's the ability to describe a picture in a sentence and have it just generated from nothing, or the ability to give a few key talking points and have a whole article written, that's technology here today, right? And I think in 5 and 10 years, the things that those machine learning models and hyperscale cloud providers will be dishing up and advancing will be pretty incredible. So it's we're definitely at an inflection point for the things machine learning is going to enable in our daily lives. I can't even give you a good prediction what that looks like in 5 years.
To what degree is that sort of machine learning, does it present a security threat, the sort of thing that you in the NSA are working on?
Yeah, anytime you have technical innovations, there'll be people who try to figure out how to weaponize that, right? And so whether it's using generated personas in scams or criminal activities to automating the hunt and search for vulnerabilities so that you're in machine time, not human time. Those are the kind of things that you'll probably see coming out of that in the criminal space.
I mean, one of the most interesting things that we have not seen that we were warned of not that long ago, and maybe we will see, is the danger of deep fakes. It was just a little while ago where the thought would be that every possible statement made by a recognized figure, political or otherwise, could be a deep fake, and we would be inundated with this sort of imagery, and it would confuse social reality. That has not happened yet. And is that something that could happen? Is that something to be scared of? Is it something the NSA works on?
Yeah. So I'm certainly concerned with it, and we have some folks working on understanding and detecting deep fakes. But I think we're at the early stages of where that technology will be implemented, and again, the creative ways it'll be applied. So I do think that deep fakes will pose a challenge, especially as they become more available to the general public. Right now, to generate a deep fake, it takes some technical rigor and some know-how. We're getting to the point where these machine learning models are available much easier for people who don't have the skills, right? I would liken it to there's a set of hackers they call script kiddies. They're people who don't understand the technology with depth, but they can run a script that automates the exploitation, the malicious behavior that they want to achieve. And so when somebody writes that capability that others can use, it makes exploitation so much easier that it's more dangerous to have that vulnerability. I expect at some point deepfakes become the realm of script kiddies, where you can just auto-generate with very little interaction something that would then turn out to be useful in a malicious or criminal act. We're not there yet.
We're obviously accustomed to and prepared or not prepared for all sorts of disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes we think about even if we don't know when they're coming. In the air and in our popular society is this sense that some similarly devastating cyber attack is imminent. is it true that like in our lifetimes or in maybe the next 10 years, let's say 15 years, is this something that our country is going to see? And I mean at the level, not simply an attack on a bank or an attack on a particular county, which we have seen, but something more fundamentally destabilizing. Is that something that is close to inevitable in American society?
Yeah, I would say it is because, I drove by gas stations with no gas and some that were open that had huge lines just because of a single malicious attack in the Colonial Pipeline ransomware. So it's not unimaginable.
And do you think that the US has a decent understanding of, which elements of society are the most vulnerable to the more potentially devastating attacks?
There is a framework, and so I think we've come a long way with some of the new structures. If you look at the role that the National Cyber Director now has, we're very early in the establishment of that role, but Director Inglis, has stepped up and started marshaling all of the capabilities of the U.S. government across to understand and then defend. And then, just the effort and the growth in CISA. So the part of DHS responsible for critical infrastructure, cybersecurity. And they've been working on a fundamental breakdown of how do you characterize the things that you most care about, the sectors and the critical national functions that need to be protected.
We've had a number of events with Jen Easterly of CISA, and one thing she's remarked on, I'm wondering what you may think about this, is a growing engagement, a productive engagement between the U.S. government dealing with cybersecurity issues and the key private companies that are busy, producing the ways in which most of us probably create our own vulnerabilities through our access to the web and probably opening ourselves up to all sorts of potential risks. Do you share that sense that like industry and government are partnering well these days, or what should be done to make them partner better?
Yeah, I mentioned our Cybersecurity Collaboration Center early on in the introduction, and that didn't exist 2 years ago. It has come an extraordinarily long way, and what we're seeing is, when I can find a piece of tradecraft that an adversary is actively using and talk to industry, they can then protect, 1.5 billion endpoints around the globe instantly through their actions and their capabilities. And then they can talk to me about where that malicious activity is coming from when it hits their endpoints. And we can try to swim upstream and then understand the actors behind it, or what they're working on next, or the scope and scale of their infrastructure that they're using. And it's a really glorious cycle that each of us understands a bit and has a role that can symbiotically cycle through and know more than either of us can know ourselves, and protect more than either of us could protect ourselves.
So you're describing a situation of some level of trust between private corporations who have their own incentives for what they do and the NSA and other government agencies that have their incentives. What do you think lies at the heart of generating that? Is it personal relationships? Is it internships or some sort of, is it consultancies? I mean, what is it you do to forge, an understanding in these worlds that, let's be honest, are quite distinct. If nothing else, the private industries don't have access to, to the sorts of clearances that are the minimum to even enter into the sort of offices that you run.
Yeah, so for us, it really is about adding value to their business, right? They want their customers to be safe. They want their infrastructure to be defended. And so we bring something to that with the expertise and then the intelligence. And the real key to that is we have worked very hard to not have to have classified conversations. We take classified material and then extract out of it the relevant things that they can action. Because if I go to a cleared individual, if you clear the chief technical officer or the CEO of a company and you bring them in and you let them in a classified space read a top secret document about a threat, you put them in a really bad position now, because they can't go and tell their security officers and their network engineers and their programmers who actually have to do the implementing. So what we've really realized is what we know is often less sensitive than how we know it. So I can talk the fact of the thing, the vulnerability or the malicious activity, without revealing how we came about to generate that insight. And so as long as I can keep generating those insights, it's really valuable. But in the end, if I know something and don't do something, there's no value in having that intelligence.
Interesting. Now, given that private companies are not American companies necessarily, I mean, they may be based here, but they're global. They're owned by whomever, happens to own their stock if they're publicly traded. They have staff located around the world with any number of potential, orientations politically and et cetera. And of course, it's quite different in agencies like the NSA and in just U.S. security and intelligence agencies generally. So to what degree are you concerned about this open line of communication with entities that are, constructed differently and are fundamentally global entities rather than American entities?
Yeah, well, the problem is global, and we work with an enormous amount of both countries and companies on this problem. So, the reality is that we have to be comfortable having a wide array of partners. And those partners include, foreign governments, foreign companies, and foreign individuals, because that's what makes up the ecosystem. And again, those are the people who can act on something. So we've got to be prepared to equip them to act.
Is it possible then for the NSA to forge relationships with companies that are, say, not the classic Silicon Valley ones, but companies based in India or even China or Indonesia? Do those present specific or particular barriers to your communication about potential vulnerabilities?
Yeah, there's certainly barriers. Our core bread and butter is, companies who have some sort of foothold in the U.S., right? That doesn't mean they're U.S. companies, but the ability to connect with them and work with them is often centered on that. We've found ways when we understand a threat in the foreign space, that's when we go to our international partners. And I think as long as somebody's not part of the problem, and I told you, for the biggest entities that are part of the problem, the Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, as long as you're not in that group, usually we can find a path and a way to work.
Interesting.
Daniel, before we run out of time,
exactly,
here,
yeah.
If we could, just two last things. One, I'd like to give Rob just a couple minutes to sort of round up his thoughts here at the end. But before he does that, I would just like to comment on something that you mentioned earlier, a question that you asked about the workforce here at NSA. So for somebody that's on the outside looking in, my impression of the folks that are doing the kinds of missions that Rob talked about, they are every bit as committed, as disciplined, as motivated as anybody that you'll find in any of the uniformed services. And the mission that they do, and that's kind of the expression, it's the mission, is extraordinarily exciting. And it the sense that you're actually doing something that's good for something beyond just you and your pocketbook. It matters. It still matters to a lot of people here in the United States. And I would encourage the students to look for employment after they graduate, to look at NSA. It's not just computer scientists that they need up here. They need people of all disciplines and of all various skill sets. And so I would encourage them to look at what they do up here at Fort Meade and the mission that they have as they think about a career going forward. And that's from somebody that's not in NSA, but again, from the outside looking in, and the way that I see the organization and the motivation of the people here. So Anyway, I just wanted to get that out to the students. I know I talk to my class about that all the time, but just to let anyone else that's on the net tonight to hear from me. And if we could, before we lose the link, just give Rob an opportunity to kind of summarize his thoughts, if he's got any last thoughts to put out.
Yeah, I would say, the cybersecurity challenge is going to be, the equivalent of the arms race. There's not going to be one solution that ends the problem. In the world that has such incentives, whether it's nation states seeking advantage on other nation states, or it's the criminal activity seeking to get profits, you're going to see people trying to innovate. And so we're going to have to continue to evolve. The marketplace today, frankly, isn't always incentivized by the best security, right? The profit motives in the ecosystem often create some perverse incentives. And so that means we're going to constantly chase some of the flaws and issues in the architectures, in the underlying devices. And so we're going to need to be really vigilant in improving the technology around this. And where that takes us is it's not going to be any one entity that solves it. It's not regulation. It's not collaboration between government and private industry. It's not international coalitions. It's not norms. It's not laws, but it's going to be a bit of all of that. And in the end, it comes also down to a piece that General Schmidle was talking about. There's people behind this, whether it's the criminals or the generals or the foreign ministers or the the hacker on the keyboard. Those are people who are incentivized by things. And if we can understand what incentivizes them, we can get after deterring them. We can get after disrupting them. And so it's not just a technology problem, it's a resource problem, it's a motivation problem, but in the end, all the way up at the end of the chain, it's a people problem.
Thank you so much, Rob Joyce. Thank you so much, General Schmidle. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. We wish you a really fine evening.